Hi, all. I'm Robert Knowles,
And I'm Richard Simpson.
and today we're going to cover what the Germans would call the Week of Suffering.
The Canadians moved to the front lines across from Vimy Ridge in the late autumn of 1916. The Battle of Vimy Ridge would be the first time all four divisions of the Canadian Corps fought together as one formation. The planning and preparations for the battle were extensive. The Canadians spent the entire winter strengthening the lines, preparing for the assault on Vimy, and training rigorously. Models of the trench systems were built, and the soldiers drilled on what they were to do. They also raided German positions to gather intelligence on enemy defenses. Extensive mining operations were undertaken, in which the Allies dug tunnels beneath the German lines and set large caches of explosives to be detonated when the time came for the attack. Elaborate tunnel systems with train tracks, piped water, lights, and huge underground bunkers to stockpile supplies and arms were also established to aid the Canadians in the battle. A week of suffering. To soften enemy defenses in preparation for the attack, the Allies made a massive and prolonged artillery barrage. The heaviest shelling was spread out over a week to avoid tipping off the Germans on exactly when the assault would begin. More than 1 million shells rained down on what the Germans would call the week of suffering. The early military aircraft of the day also played a role in the battle by sweeping enemy aircraft and observation balloons from the skies.
As I said last week, the Canadian troops that were at Vimy had just come off the Somme, where they had seen many of their fellow soldiers gunned down and many died. It was the biggest death toll Canada had ever had in a war, ever, at the Somme. And the Canadians were hell-bent and determined that that was not going to happen again. So they made sure that they were very meticulous, as Richard just pointed out. They made mock-ups of the battlefield behind the lines. And the Canadians were drilled day in, day out. If they had to go 160 meters, the mock-up was 160 meters. Everything was life-size and in charge. And they were drilled time and time again. The other thing that the Canadians did was they handed out maps to your everyday soldier, which didn't happen. Never happened. Only the officers were privileged to that information. The only thing the Canadians didn't know was the day it was going to happen. Everything else was told to them. So they knew when they had to be there, where they had to be, and what they were expected to do. This was unprecedented. Nothing like this had ever been done before. The other thing the Canadians did was they wanted to make sure that, unlike in the Somme, when the artillery guns fired to soften up the barbed wire, that the barbed wire had actually been taken out, because in the Somme it hadn't been. So after the artillery had bombarded the area that had the barbed wire, at night the Canadian troops would sneak into no man's land and confirm that the barbed wire had actually been taken out. And if not, it was shelled again. Because the Canadians were not going to have what happened in the Somme happen at Vimy. They also did a lot of underground warfare and night raids. But more on that in a minute.
The retirement from before Arras would involve the surrender of the city of Lens, with its coal mines, together with a very strong position and the Vimy Ridge between Arras and Lens, which was the scene of Foch's Battle of Artois in 1915. Southward from Arras, the Germans were now holding on to the last eastern slopes of the highland, which extends from the Channel to the plains of northern France. The positions which they now hold are foothills separated by watercourses, not easily of defense, and it seems hardly likely that the Germans will undertake to retrain for long the present front from Arras to the Bapaume-Cambrai road. The fall of Crecy, one of the last strong points of the support on the present line, will probably prove to be the last step in a very considerable withdrawal from Arras.
The Canadians, as I was saying, made sure that their preparation was thorough. And one thing that they wanted to make sure was very thorough was their artillery, where it was placed, and where it was aimed. The Canadians did this three-prong. One, by air, searching out German gun positions, but not firing on them right away, as to not give away that the Canadians knew where the guns were. They also had listening posts, listening every time the Germans fired their guns, and they would do the painstaking map drawing and triangulating the guns that way. The other way they did it was they had men on the line watching with binoculars for muzzle flashes, and then they would triangulate those guns and put those on the map, so that the day that the attack actually took place, the Canadian guns would take out the German guns, because the Canadians knew and understood that if the German guns were not silenced, the Canadians would die, and this would be a slaughter. So this was very important to the Canadians, and they took great pride in the fact that during the battle, they took out most of the German guns. But it was because of the planning that had taken place. The other thing the Canadians did during the week of suffering, as the Germans would call it, was night raids, where they would take POWs and press them for information once they got them back to the Canadian lines, to make sure that, one, the Germans didn't know that they knew where the guns were and they weren't being moved, and other information such as troop numbers and other useful information for the attack. It also put the Germans on edge because they never knew when the Canadians were going to attack. Those raids would be done at night, and they'd be done in small bursts. Unlike at the Somme and in other places where they would do major night raids, Canadians kept them to mostly small raids, except for one, and it didn't go well. So they kept to the small raids, just for information gathering and to keep the Germans on edge. The other thing that the Canadians did was they targeted the Germans. They targeted the Germans' supply lines. And that's why the Germans called it the Week of Suffering, because many of their soldiers were left without supplies, without food, for days before the battle. The Germans were so confident they were going to take the line and be able to repel anything the Canadians threw at them, that the reserve troops for the Germans were exactly 36 hours away, give or take. So the Canadians were tasked with taking it in 9. And this has been our look at the Week of Suffering. I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the video. And until next time, I'm Robert Knowles.
And I'm Richard Simpson. And please join us next week when we go to another point in history, to the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Thank you very much.